how's everybody doing today? Um, 2001, I was pacing back and forth in a solitary confinement prison cell in what turned out to be a 4.5-year stint in solitary confinement. 23-hour lockdown, 5 days a week, 24 hours the other 2 days. And on this particular day, I was actually waiting for the mailman to come. Well, not the mailman, but technically a guard who delivers mail. And that was pretty much how I passed my day. Letters, anytime I would get letters from home, it was something that gave me hope. And on this particular day, I received 3 letters. One was from a friend who was at another prison. One was from my father, who had become like my strongest supporter during my incarceration. And the third one was from my son, who at the time was roughly 9 years old. And I was always excited when I would get letters from him because he always kind of gave me updates on his artwork and things he was doing in school, and that kept me going. But this particular letter was a little bit different. For the first time in my incarceration, my son addressed how I became incarcerated. And in the letter he said, "Dad, my mom told me why you were in prison." He said, "Dad, please don't kill anymore. Jesus watches what you do." And when I heard those words and I read that letter, it was heartbreaking. You know, I grew up in Detroit. It's a very tough city, very street-oriented culture. And so I had never really stepped back and thought about the decision I've made that led to me being incarcerated. And so reading this letter made me think about something I had read in Socrates' Apology. He said, "The unexamined life isn't worth living." And so at that point, I had to go back and examine my life and figure out, how did I go from wanting to be a doctor to serving time in the solitary confinement cell? And what I discovered that it was incremental things that had transpired in my life. I grew up in a household where my mother was very abusive. She would beat us, verbally abuse us, emotionally abuse us, or neglect us. And so I ran away at the age of 13. And when I ran away, I thought I was running from a bad situation to a better situation. And in reality, I ran into a worse situation. And I ended up being seduced into the drug trade by an older, more seasoned street hustler who realized that I had nowhere to go, no way to provide food or shelter for myself or clothing. And so he offered me the opportunity to make some money selling crack, which was new to Detroit. And in my naivete as a 13-year-old, all I knew is that I wanted to feed myself, I wanted to be able to provide clothing, shelter, and I wanted to get away from the abuse. But what happened within the first 6 months, I found myself in the most horrific environment you can imagine. I was nearly beat to death and left for dead in a crack house. I was robbed at gunpoint. Several months later, my childhood friend was murdered. A couple of months later, my older brother was shot in the neck and paralyzed temporarily. A few months later, my older brother got shot. And then at the age of 17 years old, I got shot 3 times while standing on the corner of my neighborhood. When I got shot, I went to the hospital, and they basically patched me up and sent me right back to the neighborhood. So within hours of me being shot, I was right back in the same neighborhood where the shooting had occurred. What they didn't tell me is that I would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the reality of cities like Detroit and Chicago and New York, some of the tougher boroughs in New York, is that so many kids end up suffering from this that we don't really talk about. 14 months after my shooting, I got into a similar conflict, and I decided to shoot first. And tragically, I caused someone's death. And I was subsequently sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison and ultimately served 19 years. After I got that letter from my son, I started writing a journal, which kind of took me back and helped me kind of shed some of the baggage that I accumulated from growing up in this environment. And it also made me realize that I had a great deal of responsibility as a human being. First of all, to acknowledge my decision-making that led to me being incarcerated, apologize for it, and then atone through direct action. So I took initiative to really start writing about some of the issues that we face in our society in urban communities And I started challenging myself. And I went on to write novels, and I figured out how to publish my first novel. And at that time, I never knew if I was getting out of prison. Because when I was in prison, I wasn't like, the first 8 years of my incarceration, I was very bitter and very angry, so I wasn't like a model prisoner. And so at that time, I never thought I was getting out. But I had made a promise that if I ever got out, I would do everything in my power to make a difference. But what I didn't account for was that I would be coming to a very different world, a world unlike anything I could have imagined during the 19 years of my incarceration. And it's this world that I really want to talk to you about because it's a part of our society that we don't discuss enough. In urban cities now where there's a lot of urban gardening going on, they have this thing that they call food deserts, where people have very limited access to healthy, organically grown food. And when I thought about that concept, and I thought about what is a desert? It's a very harsh environment where it's hard for life to really thrive at. And it made me think about what I experienced when I got out of prison. So actually almost 3 years ago, June 22nd, 2010, one day after my 38th birthday, I walked out of prison for the first time. And nobody really prepared me for this new world I was entering. And recently people have been like, hey, how old are you? I'm like, well, I'll be 41 this year. But actually I realized recently that I'm really like 3 years old. And not because I poop in my pants or wear diapers or anything like that. But 3 years old in the sense that everything that I've had to learn in the last 3 years was information that was hidden or kept away from me for 19 years. Like whole new language. When I went to prison, like my cell phone was like this big. It's like and it came with like this bag we had to carry. And so I came out and I got this little BlackBerry. And I knew nothing about texting, Facebook, social media. I started hearing about those things and was reading a little bit about them, so I was somewhat familiar, but I never saw any of these things in action. So imagine, if you will, you get out, and people are like, hey, well, could you text me later? And I'm like, what does that mean? And like, well, it's a way that you communicate through text. And I'm like, okay, cool, well, I can write, I can type a little bit. Familiar with QWERTY, I'm kind of straight. So I started like texting, but then people would respond with like these real short little responses like LOL and LMAO, and I'm like, I don't know what none of this means, right? So I was texting and somebody was like, responded like K. And I'm like, what is K? And they was like, okay. And I'm like, okay, what? I mean, like, what is K? Like, they mean like, okay, K is K. So I was like, F you. And so they was like, what? I was like, F you, and they was like, well, why would you be so disrespectful? And I'm like, what is you talking about? Like, F you, like I finally understand. And so as I thought about like this whole process of learning all this information, it was overwhelming. I mean, imagine like when I went to prison, we had none of this. There was no Facebook, no social media, no Twitter, none of these things. And it made me think about my transition back to the community. As Micah mentioned, I'm a fellow at MIT Media Lab, which is like not the normal transition back to the community story. Most guys don't get out of prison and end up at MIT Media Lab. But fortunately, I had the aptitude because I was an honor roll student, scholarship student. So when I was in prison, I learned a lot, and I studied and I read. And so when I got to society, I literally had this rapid fire approach to learning about technology. I like started a Facebook page my first day out, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, I'm gonna figure it out. But I started to challenge myself on every level. But what I realized that when I was incarcerated, I used to be a tutor. And when we was do testing, the average guys tested out at third grade level. And so I became really overwhelmed when I thought about how hard it has been for me to transition back to society and just thinking about the magnitude that they're going to face when they come back out to a society where it's a whole new language that you have to discover. And it's very challenging. The reality is felons are faced with all type of obstacles and discriminatory practices that we don't really talk about. But I think on a fundamental level, we have a responsibility to ensure that they're capable of interacting with society as it exists today. And in order to do that, thank you. In order to do that, we're going to need some really brave and courageous people. We're going to need people who think so far outside of the box and outside of their personal judgments and opinions that's really willing to challenge politicians, legislators, on the idea of withholding valuable information. Like, there are some books that you can't even get in prison. Books related to coding, anything related to computer interfaces, some of those books are restricted. And the reality is this: I don't really care what a person's personal position is on crime. These are the facts. 95% of the people who are incarcerated will at some point return to society. And we have a responsibility to figure out what type of human beings do you want to return to society. Because honestly, without information, my willingness to tackle the overwhelming desire to learn technology, I would probably be trying to figure out how I could pull a heist off in here. It's like a lot of MacBooks up in here. I can get some, you know what I'm saying? I can get some money in the hood for those. But that's the reality, because when you withhold hope from people and you marginalize them, you penalize them even after they've served their sentence by impeding their ability to learn and progress and integrate into society, you do one of the gravest injustice to the overall society that can occur. And we have 2.5 million people incarcerated right now. And at some point, 95% of those people will return to the community. So my challenge today is to ask you all to figure out ways to engage people such as myself who are really have insights to that environment. Figure out ways, how can we really challenge legislators to see the humanity in people and really to protect our community in a real, genuine way. So that's my challenge to y'all. I appreciate y'all time. Thank you for having me here. Peace, y'all.